I will keep my microphone on, however. Okay, are we good? Okay, so that was the first talk. If I were a reasonable person, that would have been the first talk, and I would have gone in slower detail, and But now I'm too excited, so now I'm going to move on to the second talk. So that first section was talking about the how different formats encode what they encode, what is represented. In the second section, I want to think about the ways in which different formats affect how we interpret what is represented, right? So and here I'm thinking of, this is drawing on my work on perspectives, interpretive perspectives on contents. So now to do that, I'm going to have to give you a rapid fire tour through the way I think about perspectives. And then I want to spell out a little bit about how they apply differently in the cases of, explore a little bit how they apply differently in the cases of pictures versus language. Okay. So semiotic systems vary in how much they in how they express and invite perspectives on the represented content. So we've seen something about what they can represent. They also vary in how they invite perspectives on those contents. So what do I even mean by a perspective? We talk about these. We have these terms of orientation and vision and outlook and perspective. The perspectival language is very familiar, ubiquitous, and powerful. But what does it even mean? It's got to be something metaphorical. So what is it? As I understand it, an interpretive perspective is a clustered set of dispositions, cognitive dispositions to notice, relate, and respond to subjects as one encounters them. So I'm going to say something about each of those things: noticing, relating, and responding. So noticing. Attention focuses on information of certain kinds. How does it do that? It parses lower level features into kinds relative to a taxonomy. And that taxonomy presupposes certain distributions of features. It assumes there are lower level features and they tend to cluster together in certain kinds of homeostatic ways. And some of those features matter and other features don't matter, right? So one taxonomy might be focused on social status and social roles. Another taxonomy might be focused on economic value, and another taxonomy might be focused on, sort of tangible properties of middle-sized dry goods. Those are very different taxonomies that prioritize different lower-level features. So attention parses features into kinds, recognizable, retokenable kinds, which matter for the agent. Attention also selects some of those parsed features as coming into attention at all, as registering at all. And then among those features that are attended to and noticed, it assigns them differential prominence. By prominence, I mean, so some features stick out more. They're more prominent than other features in our attention. What does prominence mean? Here I'm following basically Tversky, what he says about salience. So he talks about there are two subsidiary categories of intensity and diagnosticity. A feature can be more prominent by being more intense or more diagnostic, or both. So these are distinct, often correlated dimensions of prominence. So intensity is high signal to noise ratio, just like how bright is the light relative to other lights in the room. How saturated is this patch of blue relative to other patches of paint blue in this picture. Sometimes, like light in a room, intensity can be a very local physical feature measure, but sometimes, so it's high signal to noise ratio relative to a baseline. Sometimes that signal to noise ratio is a very physical, can be measured in straightforward local physical terms, but often it's highly cognitively mediated, right? So a patch of blue in a painting might be highly prominent to you, might stick out to you, not just because it's more saturated than the other patches in the painting, but also because it's unusually saturated for paintings of that genre, right? And that's because of your knowledge of the genre. So that's intensity. Diagnosticity, by contrast, so intensity is like contrast with the context, sort of high signal to noise ratio. Diagnosticity is utility, classificatory utility. How useful is this property for telling you something about other properties? So, you know, the shape of a snake's head might not, or the shape of a snake's pupils might not be highly intense. It might not be very marked. It might not be a snake's stripes might not be bright red or very bold. But head, if you know that head shape or pupil shape tend to be correlated with being poisonous, then you are interested in being, you know, bitten by a poisonous snake, then that feature is going to be more prominent in your attention than it would otherwise, right? So a feature, the fact that a feature is diagnostic of something you care about can make it more prominent in your attention. Okay, so that's attention. Attention affects how we notice, what we notice, and therefore, in turn, what we recall. So one aspect of a perspective, an interpretive perspective, and one way in which perspectives differ among each other is in how they allocate attention. But it's not just that they form, perspectives form lists of prioritized features. It's also they connect those features into complex networks of centrality. How much would this rest of our thinking about this thing change if you change this feature? Somebody's got to mute, besides me, is to mute their mic. So there are many, many, many different ways in which features can be connected up to one another. Some of them are sort of scientifically respectable, features like causation and correlation. Some of them are more conceptual, like material and logical implication. And some of them are more normative, like moral desert and aesthetic fit. And one of the things I think is characteristic of a lot of human cognition is we have a kind of just intuitive association between features. Our mind goes from one feature to another, maybe because of idiosyncratic features of our past, like we bite into a cookie and we think of our grandmother and tea, or our great aunt. But we want those connections to be meaningful and justified, and so we impute bases to them that might not be fully normatively warranted. So we impute causation when really there's just correlation. We impute moral justification when really there's just correlation. But the fact here is, the main point is, we connect features up together into complex holistic networks. And then finally, on the basis of how we prioritize and connect up the features that we do connect, we then evaluate. We respond to those subjects that we encounter in different kinds of ways. So we act on them, we evaluate them morally, we feel emotionally toward them, and aesthetically toward them in different kinds of ways. And so just the most in-your-face, familiar, crass examples of this, of all of ways in which perspectives can influence our thinking, involve social kinds and involve prejudicial perspectives on social kinds. So these are the ways in which, despite myself, given that I am socially competent as an American, my attention about I have a perspective on gender and on what it is to be a woman that is not something that I fully reflectively endorse, but it still drives, what I pay attention to, what I notice, what I expect, what kinds of causal explanations I tend to impute, and what I'm sort of surprised or disturbed or, find pleasing. So stereotypes and stereotypical thinking are reflections of ways in which we have these intuitive perspectives. But I think it's also important that perspectives, and sometimes those come apart, those are intuitive perspectives come apart from what we reflectively endorse. But I think it's also really important that we have perspectives, say, on scientific domains, right? So it's not just this low-level overlearned sort of topics. We also have, you might contrast a Kantian perspective and a consequentialist perspective on, morality, and you might contrast a macroeconomic and a microeconomic sort of analysis or perspective on, particular financial transactions. art is often deeply invested in trafficking in and connecting us, expressing perspectives. So perspectives, as I've just described them, they're these complex cognitive dispositions. They're very abstract. They're very amorphous, hard to get a hold of. They're these ongoing dispositions. One important way in which we grab a hold of them is through frames. So as I'm thinking of them, a frame is a representational vehicle. It's something you can get a hold of that crystallizes a perspective into a simple, shareable, stable form. So a bunch of my work has been about different kinds of linguistic and non-linguistic framing devices. So metaphors, slurs, fictions, also telling details, things that are just like, a little detail that tells you what you need to know about somebody in general. You might also memes, mantras, and symbols. So some examples. Juliet is the sun gives you an overall way of thinking about Juliet, an open-ended sort of principle for making sense of Juliet. Boys will be boys is in itself tautologous, but is highly encapsulates a kind of attitude about how boys are disposed to act and how it's justified for them to act. Minds are computers is a slogan that is a frame that encapsulates and crystallizes an approach to analyzing and thinking about the mind. Black Lives Matter, again, a slogan. They need not be linguistic, right? The thin blue line flag. I'm sorry, these are all such American examples. I hope that they resonate enough for you. The thin blue line flag, which is, the American flag with a thin blue line in the middle, which represents, it's black and white, blue line in the middle, and it represents the police as the thin line separating order from chaos. And it's often used as a kind of, I see enough nodding that I'm not going to talk about anybody anymore. And the pride flag, right, the rainbow flag, that is, again, an encapsulation. It's a frame that encapsulates, crystallizes a perspective, an open-ended way of construing a whole range of topics, not just communicating a particular proposition. Okay, so perspectives, they're, I think, deeply intuitive, they're ubiquitous in our thinking, they're important, but they differ from propositional attitudes as they're standardly understood. The first thing which I've been emphasizing is that they're open-ended tools for thought rather than thoughts per se. They're not particular contents, they're ways of they don't give you information. They don't make cuts and possibility space in their own right. Rather, they give you a way of handling information as it comes in, whatever that information might be. That's their primary function. As such, they can, but need not involve any particular propositional commitment. So one of the really sort of characteristic and sometimes frustrating aspects of a perspective is, say you're having a perspectival debate. You're debating with somebody who has a different perspective and you're trying to come to agreement. One of the things that is frustrating is that each of you can assimilate and explain away what looks to you like honestly assimilate, and what looks to them like explaining away any given piece of data, right? And so that's this way in which a perspective is deeper than any particular propositional commitment. It may be deeper than any propositional commitment. That is part of what's so powerful, but also can be frustrating in having a conversation. And then the last thing that I want to say now, there's obviously a lot more to say about this, but the thing that is really important for me and that I want to really lean on is that they're not just tools for forming propositional attitudes. What really matters is that they are implemented dispositions to form and update cognitive structures, intuitive cognitive structures. That is, cognitive structures that are that actually regulate your interpretation, and that are partly but not entirely under voluntary control. So this is why I've got my little figure here. This is why I think that the sort of appeal to the perceptual is so compelling. There are lots of ways in which you might want to think about why we use this perceptual language in talking about cognitive perspectives. This is the part I want to really lean on. A perspective is an implemented cognitive gestalt. Right? It's a way of forming cognitive gestalts. And that means it has to really function, it has to be clicked into your intuitive thinking. So this figure here is an ambiguous figure. It can be seen in one of two ways. An old lady and a young lass, usually in a group about this size. There are about five. I can take some time and lead you through. And there are about five people in a group of this size who can only see the figure one way rather than the other. They're trying to see the figure the other way. They are taking information on board. They believe that the figure can be seen. That the little bump there is the old wart on the old lady's nose, or that this line here is the young lady's necklace, right? They believe these bits of propositional information, but having that belief and looking at the picture, any particular piece of propositional information is neither necessary nor sufficient for seeing the picture in the relevant way. When you do see the figure in the relevant way, it clicks into your actual perceptual sort of structure and regulates it. So trying to see the figure in a certain way can help, but it's not sufficient. And it can, seeing can, intrude unbidden seeing something a certain way can intrude unbidden, although you would rather it didn't. So what matters to both a perceptual gestalt and a cognitive perspective is that it actually regulates your intuitive thinking in terms of what you notice, how you relate what you notice, and how you respond. So it has to actually regulate what sticks out to you in your attention, what you actually notice, what you actually recall in certain contexts, what kinds of intuitive associations you actually make, and what you actually expect on that basis, and what kinds of affective responses you have. You can reflectively endorse a perspective or any set of propositions that are are associated with it, but that's not the same as having the perspective. Having the perspective involves actual implementation in one's intuitive cognitive processes. Whew. Okay, so that's my super rapid fire tour through what I mean by an interpretive perspective. An interpretive perspective is this abstract cognitive set of dispositions, cluster of dispositions. Now, let's turn over and say, how does that work out differently? How does that play out in the context of these different artistic media of pictures and stories? So one of the things I'm really interested in is how do we understand? I'm interested in making sense of this notion of perspective at this abstract level. And to do that, I've started thinking about the notion of point of view in a more literal, concrete sense, right? And so pictures do have literal, concrete points of view. So point of view exploits geometric projection from an egocentric origin source. And a host of other kinds of compositional factors, which I'm not expert in. Things like things like coloring and location in scene. So lots of compositional factors in order to strongly encourage a certain way of parsing the marked surface and thereby of parsing the contents that are being represented. It also exploits the literal point of view and these other compositional factors to focus attention within those parsed parts, and then to link them into a dynamic, holistic, perceptual gestalt, where this perceptual gestalt then expresses and suggests an analogous cognitive gestalt. So here, I think it's useful to go back from this super abstract thing I just said and look at the Caravaggio painting. Right? So Caravaggio made a bunch of choices, which are compositional choices involving literal point of view, but also these other kinds of compositional factors, which then they express and induce in their viewers a certain kind of cognitive, interpretive perspective. So, Abraham is at the center of the picture. He takes up a lot of space, partly because he's depicted laterally rather than side on. His coloration is all sort of darker or more somber and sallow. It doesn't show up in my printout here, but the angel and Isaac are both really bright pink white, in contrast to the sort of yellow sallowness of Abraham. There's this, physical sort of gesture carried through from the angel's arm through Abraham's arm to Isaac's neck. The knife is very dark and, very high contrast against the whiteness of Isaac's skin. The background is much, much darker, and then there's these, further literal point of view remoteness behind that. So all of those kinds of different compositional factors, and art historians and art critics do a great job of talking about this in great detail. Those encourage attention they individuate the marked surface into various objects, which are separated and linked in certain kinds of relations. And so we parse and focus and connect the objects that are depicted in certain kinds of ways. And then those suggest and induce a interpretive perspective. And in this case, I think it's one that emphasizes the monumentality of this thing that Abraham is doing to Isaac, right? And it feels to me like it emphasizes the violence that's being sort of enacted on Isaac and the sort of terror in of his response. Whew, okay, so that I'm not an art historian or art critic, but that's the kind of thing that way in which painters, picture makers exploit literal point of view and these other aspects of the low-level, bare-bones content, and the way in which bare-bones contents are amplified into richer contents in order to express and regulate our perspectives in response to those. What about language? How does language communicate perspectives communicate perspectives and regulate perspectives? Well, one of the things here, part of what the axe I really want to grind is the way in which I think natural languages are very different from predicate calculus, which we tend to take as our model. We don't even notice that it's merely a model. That's what we're fixated on when we're thinking about language. So natural languages are really shot through with perspectival mechanisms, so both conventional mechanisms and sort of pragmatic, sometimes formally modelable pragmatic mechanisms for regulating perspective. So some of the most obvious ones here are at the lexical level, lexical expression. So, the choice of point of view, literal point of view in terms of which pronoun you're choosing, I versus he, or I versus you. Also register, right? Tu versus vous, like formality and register. That can get very nuanced. Also, indexical orientation. So part of what I think is interesting about the Genesis, the way Genesis is written, who was it? Was it Elisa who said, like, this is a very simple story. It doesn't have a lot of adjectives. It doesn't have a lot of like the stuff that seems very like richly aesthetic. But one of the things I think is interesting here is the ways in which, as you read the story, there's a ton of perspectival work happening here in terms of, say contrast between he looked from afar, the use of the choice to talk about coming versus going, right? Those things are ways of anchoring attention, anchoring sort of interpretation, in particular, space, literal, spatiotemporal, and cognitive space within a depicted scene. And then, obviously, it's sort of a big part of what language does is sort of directly parse and classify and evaluate the contents that are being depicted in fairly laden terms. So, we talk about thick terms in language, but even terms we don't think of as thick are already fairly thick, right? There's lots of thick terms and there's also a lot of thickness going on. So here the choice to talk about it is a sacrifice as opposed to a slaughter or a murder, right? That's a highly loaded perspective choice. Also in this passage, the Lord says he will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. That's a highly sort of interpretively, perspectively laden mode of expression. So that was talking about which particular words you use. There's also a ton about discourse structure, the ways in which sentences, words and sentences are structured into more complex units that regulate attention in nuanced, complicated ways. So one thing is just, unlike pictures, which give you a ton of content at once, sentences provide pieces of content in linear order. And so that is used to regulate attention on, you're paying attention to a certain thing at a certain time in order. But then that those contents, which are presented in linear order, are then also connected up into complex structures, for instance, by connectives like then, so, or but, which forge abstract linkages between, at a very high abstract level between these contents. Also things like clefting. Behind him was a ram that focuses, on the him in a way that you wouldn't have to do. Presupposition. These things are all ways of foregrounding and backgrounding different pieces of information. And then one of the things I find really poignant about this passage is the use of repetition, and in particular, when the way Abraham says a bunch of times, and our Genesis says a bunch of times, and he said, "Here I am," right? And so you hear this as a response. He's torn. He's saying, and all he's saying is, "Here I am," and he's saying that to God, and he's saying that to his son, and they're pulling in these opposite directions. And so just the repetition of the simple phrase has, I think, a really powerful perspectival effect. So use of emphasis. Okay, so there's a lot more to be said. The different disciplines say a lot more along these lines, but there's a lot more nuanced work to be said about how these media afford perspectival opportunities. They contain perspectival mechanisms, and the ways in which particular artists and particular artworks manipulate those perspectival dimensions in order to communicate perspectives. So all communication, inevitably, all representation, I think, inevitably navigates perspectival choice points. You gotta communicate somehow, and your choice of which way to communicate is gonna reveal and induce certain kinds of perspectives. So that, and then in the context of art, that becomes an especially sort of high focus. And so, and in particular, I think a large measure of what we mean by artistic style has to do with the way the producer navigates perspectival choices in a fairly consistent way in order to induce and habituate us into a certain kind of perspective. So just more specifically, artworks are frames. They're ways, they're among the most powerful tools we have for sharing and acquiring, sharing perspectives with one another, for acquiring new perspectives, and for habituating ourselves to perspectives we might sort of get in the abstract, but not really understand at a deep intuitive level. And that perspectival understanding is going to involve both sort of iconic simulation and also this much more abstract sort of interpretive perspectival imagination that I've been focusing on. All right, that's the second talk compressed into the second section of the current talk. How we were doing okay. All right, Marta.